The Worldview of Paul Cezanne by Janeroberts. Chapter 9. The Dynamics of Creativity. The creative self, color, the emotions, and how to court inspiration. Entry number 19, March 4th, 1976, 4:45 to 5:30 a.m. All of nature has an unfinished, always changing quality. Therefore, natural objects should not be painted in an ideal fashion, but with great attention to their individual characteristics. It is better, for that matter, not to pick the most perfect-seeming model, whether for plant, fruit, or flower, for that apparent perfection will not last in the fresh version, and the painted version, lasting as an object in the painting, will seem artificial. Even the perfect bud, painted however cleverly, will not open in the painting's frame. So the changing face of nature should be captured, an impossibility yet a challenge no serious artist can forsake. Nature's vitality must be suggested through the artist's strokes and squiggles of color, each seemingly alive, rising up from the canvas as, for example, the stem from the ground, not all at once with its final thickness and height, but in strokes mimicking nature's own rhythms, as the stem grows invisible, but vital inches at a time. That is, you cannot see the stem grow, but only feel its growth as you watch it at any given time. Nor does it thicken all at once, so the brush strokes must capture that invisible thrust, and then seem suddenly to appear, even as the stem that seems grown. The brush strokes, each of them, must somehow represent the unseen seconds in which the stem mysteriously grows, the thrust of creativity that then gives rise to the flower's bloom. For the blossom is not just thrust upon the stem, it explodes from it, and the stem must be artistically vital enough to bear the force within it. So the flower should be painted from the center, where its growth began, and not at the outer petals, which, however beautiful, were thrust outward from the bud's center. Nature's own processes should then be followed when painting natural objects, and when this is done, the painting faithfully follows nature's thrust. As no flower appears without first its stem, so in painting rocks or rock ledges, the lowest should be executed first, for lines and strokes have their own kind of weight also, and their own kind of timing. This timing is generally invisible, yet the body's senses register unconsciously what the eye does not immediately perceive. So the first strokes on a canvas are supportive ones and should come in a certain order, following nature's own processes. If this is not done, the viewer will sense the outrage to usual order without even realizing it. If a mountaintop is painted over the ground hills, then the relationship will not be right or fitting, for in nature no mountain tip appears in mid-air without its base. The same does not apply to manufactured objects, except for buildings, which should be done from the base upward. People do not grow from the feet up. Their limbs seem to grow from the thrusting trunk, where vital organs reside. The person's power is in the trunk and the head, for even without limbs, a man would still be a person, but without the trunk and head, there's nothing. The limbs grow out of the trunk like stems, extending a person's power, budding into the hands and feet. Even a child knows its thoughts come from its head. Some infants take a while to recognize their hands and feet as their own. So the trunk must be strong, suggesting the house of the emotions. Entry number 20, March 17th, 1976, 4:45 to 5:30 p.m. The artist must celebrate even in ignorance. Now, the artist must celebrate even his ignorance. Okay, that's better. Certainly he must recognize it and not escape it, for as he matches himself against it, he moves ahead with zeal and industry. More than any other art, painting is a wedding of wisdom and innocence, emotion and reason, spontaneity and order, in which the child and the man in the artist merge to form a new creative self. This creative self arouses the child's vision, but re-aroused in the man, that vision is also fired up by a lively sympathy that the child does not possess, or so it seems to me in retrospect. The man must ever keep the child alive within him, while at the same time using a dedication and discipline alien to the child. In so doing, the artist raises the child within himself to a new degree. The child within the artist wants to live. He is crafty enough to use the man's training to express his own vision, but the child's vision seeps into the adult, of course, and the child in the artist becomes aware of the adult's techniques. Each needs the other, though there is constant tension between the two, who together form the one creative self. This creative self knows when it's time to let the child take over, when to give in to sudden agitated simplicities of brushstrokes, harsh squiggling, scribbles of paint, disjointed lines, and when to impose order. Most of all, the creative self knows how to bring discordant or seemingly discordant elements together, triumphantly choosing a particular hue that suddenly resolves an entire composition by stabilizing too agitated emotion without stopping it, or by inserting action which seemed not to be there just the moment before. It is with color that the child and the man in the artist often confront each other, for the child does not want to wait for a color's resolution, is impatient with gradations, and is ever ready to overpower a painting with the most vivid of pigments. This is because the child's emotions lack the man's subtlety, or so it seems to me, and so he is attracted to and even fascinated by the most brilliant colors. Any kind of motion also attracts him, and he is impatient of repose. The artist must understand these qualities. He must take advantage of them to combat any predispositions to over-sobriety and order, and use their thrust to carry his own ideas forward, knowing when to let the qualities rise to the surface or skim just beneath. Children love to copy old magical instincts, perhaps, by which they hope an image will bring itself alive. The child likes fantasy or literal interpretations, but something in his nature dislikes combining the two. The child wants his drawing of an object to look like its model and is literal-minded enough to become upset, say, as the picture of a dog with too many legs, once he knows the difference. On the other hand, he will be quite happy with drawing a monster which does not exist in the same fashion, but gives his fantasy freedom. So oddly enough, often the child is the man, often the child in the man will be the part of the artist that wants to copy a landscape or a fruit or person and add nothing that does not strictly belong to those images. In that respect, at least, the artist must lend his imagination to the child within himself. The alliance of the child and the man is not static, however, but dynamic, with each changing position within the resulting creative self, each rising and falling in psychological rhythms, as dependable and yet as changeable as the tides. This dynamic quality means that the artist must be responsive to his emotions, knowing when to peak and when to recede. There are signals with which he should become familiar in himself. When the dynamic emotions recede from the shores of his immediate experience, leaving a gap or seeming bareness so that he feels separated from the source of his own being, then the artist can be sure that the dynamics of the creative self are operating, for then the power of the emotions rushes out into the seas of the soul, or psyche if you prefer, and it will create with great force, bringing with it tidal waves of creativity, torrents of images and intuition. Then, in the interim, the artist must learn how to bide his time and lay in wait for his own creativity. It is a strange period, for while the artist seems to himself to be doing nothing of note, arranging his studio perhaps, preparing canvases, the creative self is working with amazing rapidity. Yet the artist may feel empty and dry, as the shore may be empty and washed clean of shells when the tides are out. For like the shore, the artist's mind must be wiped clean in the very same way. Then, with a rush, the tidal wave of emotion and sensation roar, seemingly from no more, and the wise artist will be prepared. He will have rested in the meantime, and not worried or berated himself over his lack of creativity, for it is now that the artist must be his own creative self, rising above child and man, compassionately and wisely using each of their characteristics to his own ends. He must ride the power of his own emotions and creativity as a man might ride the tidal waves, knowing the forces of the waters, the winds and the undercurrents. He must capture the images that suit him from the thunderous, incessant, ever-changing ones that come, it seems, too quickly. He must decide at once, know when to capture an image in the net of his mind and hold it, so that later his craft can give it form on canvas. In another way, at such times, the artist is like a fisherman, and certain characteristic themes will serve as his craft or boat. These he will recognize as certain favorite themes, ideas, or concepts that carry him safely into the deepest seas. He uses these and then knows when to leap overboard, figuratively speaking, plunging down to retrieve an exotic creature from the depths and returning then to his platform. Or he rides his concepts while watching for these strange creatures of inspiration to appear, tossed up perhaps to the surface of the seas for a moment, and then he leans over and he grabs them up. The concepts or favorite themes then serve as containers to hold new intuitions and insights that might otherwise escape. The artist's knowledge of painting is used in the same way. It must be ever at the fingertips so that inspiration can be captured at once and preserved. The fisherman might put his catch on ice. The artist must preserve his catch in paint. Entry number 21, March 24th, 1976, 11:45 to 12:15 p.m. The painter must steep himself in nature, for the mobility of the shadows and winds and the ever-versatile alteration of light provide an emotional extension that lifts man's moods out of himself and allows him to identify with the greater emotional tones of the earth that everywhere sweep across the landscape. A man's moods are reflected in his facial expressions and posture, in the most minute wrinkles of the skin or tremors of the hand or the thigh. The moods of the earth are expressed in a more grand fashion. With the entire planet is the field of expression, but the smallest motion of a half-hidden leaf is as much a statement of the earth's mood as a half-smile, gone for a moment in a woman's face. More than this, man for centuries unknown had his habitat out in the open, intimately in contact with the earth's changing seasons. That provided a worthy panorama in which his own natural emotional experience could be reflected and expressed. The wind's anger was his own and roused within him a healthy agitation that whirled as constructively within his soul as the storms raged across the land. So he and the earth were refreshed together in the same way the calm of the night breezes conjured up man's gentleness, so that man and weather together had a bond that is now largely forgotten. So the painter should immerse himself in nature, take long walks in solitude, learn to listen to the earth's many nuances, learn its language of flickering images, and see the signals it flashes in terms of colors, whose vibrations change in every instant. Observing in this way, the painter can also learn to discern those inner shapes that pervade all matter, those sensed forms from which matter arises. Yet these must be only hinted at, for sometimes one large sensed form may seem to give rise to many smaller ones while it gently towers over them. In other instances, small shapes seem to anticipate larger ones that never actually appear at all. Sometimes I think that the earth retains ghost images of all the natural shapes that it has known, so that a given field may also contain pseudo-shapes, the forms of mountains or seas that once covered it in other times. Unknowingly, a painter may give a field a wave-like cast, so that the grasses suggest seas, and never know why he has done so. Perhaps there are indeed sights to paint that we do not see, hidden within the forms that are apparent, pictures within pictures. Often I study nature with this in mind. Outside of such considerations, though, the landscape should be the painter's main studio, a living studio, for the objects in fields and woods are constantly move, suggestive of creativity, while the objects in a room are stationary. In his home, man tries to stabilize the seasons, stop their motion, and so his emotions become cramped. In his home, man dilutes his emotions and hopes to escape nature. A man must do much work in his studio, and there arranges objects of nature to suit his purposes. He arranges his own emotions to suit his purposes too, but he must never forget the greater design of nature or of the emotions, nor lose sight of his identification with the land's mobility. The painter's emotions represent his mode of action. They sweep through his inner being as the winds sweep across the earth. The earth uses the storm winds, and a man must learn to use his emotions, even the wildest of them, in the same way. This can be achieved to some degree if the man learns from nature itself and observes how nature utilizes its own forces. While hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes ravish the land at different times with varying intensities, the world overall maintains its dependable stance and all stability we require. The storm's seeming disorder is regulated in a certain overall fashion that escapes us. Storms are expressed, often violently, and yet their very expression, because of its cathartic quality, limits the nature of the storm, while releasing its force at the same time. The force dissipates, and the violence itself becomes part of a larger order and calm, so through such violent action, the earth stabilizes its own elements and redistributes its parts. Its violence is not only contained, but through expression, it is always kept in bounds. Its violence is not only contained, but through expression, it is always kept in bounds. Even such storms have shape and form, follow certain laws. Floods behave in one manner, droughts in another. Snowstorms do not come in summertime, and dust storms do not blow through forests. So the natural forces, the emotions in a painter, must be understood in the same manner. They must be expressed, but through form. There is a certain violence in creativity that no sweet words can hide, but it is an innocent violence in which man's emotions as natural forces form landscapes, still lifes, or portraits instead of wind, rain, lightning, or summer storms. So he must know when to strike with his emotions and when to hold them suspended, and how to sense the inner shape of his feelings so that his strokes and colors can erupt from him as naturally and yet expertly as rain from a cloud. Nor can he escape nature even in his studio, for his feelings can be affected by the weather even though the drapes are closed, and those emotions and connections will seep into his decisions about his work, even if he never goes outside. Artists with a constant eye out for the academies or for sales have a tendency to ignore their own feelings and knowledge by trying to appeal to superimposed values of a social nature. They force their emotions into stereotyped images, conforming more to the restricting conventions of drawing rooms where even language itself is stiff as stone. Any conventions, religious, social, or political, can ruin an artist's work if they are slavishly followed. Nor should the artist try to point out one message through his paintings, for each one is his own statement. And if an overall statement is made, then it must happen naturally. If a field at any given time is a certain kind of field, then even though it contains many varieties of flowers, weeds, and rocks, the shape of the painter's work in that respect is ever coming from the inside and cannot be applied from without and made to conform to his intellectual idea of what it should be. 12:20 to 12:30 p.m. Paintings, then, are natural formations rising up or emerging from a man's psyche as surely as mountains thrust up from the ground. A man himself has natural features so that his emotions, intellect, dreams, and accomplishments can be compared to different objective features of the land. Actually, the painter merges the inner landscape of the mind with the exterior one. Literally, his dreams take shape. Each brush stroke follows the motion of the painter's feelings, while the overall power of a particular work comes from the painter's predominating emotion at the time, with all his colors and brush strokes following in a complementary manner, so that the interweaving actions form an intricate emotional lacing, bodied over with pigment. Underpaintings or underlayers represent emotional archaeology, the originating emotional patterns upon which the later painting forms. So the final layers must be the expert rendering of all those earlier layers, the resolution of their incompleteness. I always muttered, ah, 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 whenever at last I resolved each final stroke in a painting with which I was pleased. And that's the end of chapter 9. And chapter 10 is entitled Art as a Natural Function, as a Language, the Origins of Painting, Magic and Brushstrokes as Nature's Signatures. Hope you enjoyed that. Till soon.